So welcome to Anatomy and Physiology. This is our first lecture. It's called Principles of Anatomy and Physiology. Our goal today is to define the terms anatomy, physiology, and describe how they can be interrelated. We're going to explain the concept of homeostasis, describe examples within the human body, and we're going to provide examples of the anatomical levels of the structural organization. I'm so excited to get started with you. So here we go. So what is A&P, or anatomy and physiology? So anatomy is the scientific study of the body's structures themselves. And then physiology is the scientific study of the chemistry and the physics of those structures of the body. So how do they function? So anatomy would be like the physical structures themselves, and then the physiology is the function. How are they working? Okay, and so what we want to do is we can look at the gross anatomy or the macroanatomy. Now it's going to be our larger structures. That would be like looking at the brain itself. This is stuff that we can see with our eyes. And then we have microanatomy, and microanatomy is going to be looking at the cellular level, sometimes even smaller than the cellular level. Like for instance, in this picture here, you can see the neuron cells, and our brain, the outer part that we can see, is actually just a whole bunch of these neuron cells stuck together. So what's required to sustain human life? We need oxygen. Obviously, when we breathe in, we're taking in oxygen. That oxygen can be used by the cells within our body. They do what's called cellular respiration. And that's how we're going to get out the energy, okay, out of those cells, is that we use the oxygen. The oxygen is what's called the final electron receptor. We also need nutrients. When we eat our food, most often we're going to be converting that into the most simplest form into glucose. And glucose in the presence of oxygen is in fact that cellular respiration equation that we're going to talk about in a little bit. And we can only live within a narrow range of temperatures as well as a narrow range of atmospheric pressure. If we get too high in pressure or too low in pressure, then we can't breathe out that oxygen, because air pressure has to do with oxygen levels as well, and we can actually get crushed if we're at too high of a pressure. So the functions of human life is, number one, we have to be organized. Okay, so our body is actually organized into body systems. We also organize by cells, tissues, etc. We have metabolism. Metabolism is the sum of catabolism and anabolism. We're going to talk in great detail about what catabolism and what anabolism is, but this sort of simplest way is that catabolism is the breaking down of larger parts, and anabolism is building them back up. We have responsiveness. If human life has to be responsive, we have to be able to respond to our environment, as well as what's going on internally. And we do that through two different feedback processes. We have negative feedback and positive feedback. We have moved, so we have to be able to move those organs themselves. The cells have to organize and move themselves, as well as even muscles, right? Our muscles move. Our skeletal muscles, we can see them moving. And then our smooth muscles on the inside of our body, they're also moving. Development, our body has to be able to differentiate or change. Our cells will change from just the simplest forms, right? So we started as an egg and a sperm. Each one of you began that way, but you don't look like an egg and you don't look like a sperm, right? And so that tells us that our cells are able to differentiate or to change. We have to be able to grow, so we're going to increase those numbers of cells. We also can increase the amount of non-cellular material, and our cell size themselves can actually change. And there's a huge range of cell sizes. Eggs, for instance, are pretty large cells, while sperm is not. It's a really tiny type of cell. And then reproduction. We have to be able to do meiosis and mitosis. Meiosis is what's happening when we're going to get to our sex gametes, which again are those eggs and those sperm. And then mitosis is how we copy and divide into more cells, so our somatic cells or our body cells. So this is what I call going from atom to atom. So here we start with the smallest form of matter that retains properties, and that is in fact an atom. And this one, for this example, we might use an atom of hydrogen. Okay? And when we take two hydrogen molecules and we put them with or two hydrogen atoms and we put them with an oxygen atom, that would be that red one, we're going to get to water, H2O. So that would be a molecule of water. We can take and add in some carbon in there, some more hydrogen, some more oxygen. We get CHO. We can form a macromolecule like a carbohydrate. This would be a larger one, right? That macro, again, we're seeing that. Okay. When we combine them together, we can form organelles. Organelles, you may have noticed when we talk about cells and their different cellular components, is that we have different types of organelles that are going to form cells. Multiple types of cells can form tissues. Multiple types of tissues can form organs. Multiple types of organs can form organ systems, and multiple types of organ systems are then going to form an organism or an atom, as we say. So atom to atom. Okay. So let's talk about some of those organ systems. The integumentary system, that's going to it's enclosing our internal body structures. So we have our hair, our skin, our nails. That's actually the first system that we're going to study here in A&P1. The skeletal system is going to help to support the body. It's going to enable our movement with our muscular system. Okay. We have the cartilage, the bones, and the joints. Okay. We have our muscular system. That's the third system that we're going to study here in A&P1. It's going to help to enable our movement. It also helps to maintain our body temperature. Bet you didn't know that your muscles were keeping you warm. Okay, and so we have our skeletal muscles and tendons. Our nervous system is going to detect and process our sensory information. It helps to activate our bodily responses so we actually can respond to our environment using those negative or positive feedback mechanisms that we talked about. Okay, so we have our brain, our spinal cord, and our peripheral nerves. We have our endocrine system and our cardiovascular systems. We're going to get to those in A&P2, but you can see the endocrine system is going to secrete hormones. It helps to regulate our bodily processes. It's more of a slow moving and long term, whereas our nervous system is more quick to respond. Our cardiovascular system is going to be our heart, our blood vessels that helps to deliver the oxygen and the nutrients to our tissues, as well as to pull the waste out, and it helps to equalize the temperature within the body. We have our lymphatic system. Lymphatic system helps to return fluid to the blood and helps to defend against our pathogens. So that pathogens would be like bacteria, virus, fungi, anything that can make you sick. And our respiratory system helps to remove carbon dioxide from the body, and it delivers the oxygen to our blood. Digestive and urinary system have to do with waste products, removing the waste from any undigested food or from our blood, and then processes our food and our drinks. And then we have the reproductive system. So the male reproductive system and the female reproductive system are very different, but you'll find that they actually begin very similarly. So let's talk about that tissue level of organization. So remember when we have a group of cells, okay, so we can take a whole bunch of heart muscle cells and we can group them together and they will actually form a heart tissue. Now all of the heart tissue it's not all the same in that it's not the same types of cells. There's multiple types of heart muscles or heart tissue cells that are then going to form that heart or the organ. So our human physiological environment includes all of our internal conditions, and those internal conditions have to be optimized so that our individual cells can function and that our body can remain organized. So when we talk about our human physiological environment, when we say this internal, we're usually talking about what's happening inside of a cell, an individual cell. And when we say external, we're talking about outside of the cell. We're not necessarily talking about outside of the body itself. Water is an essential component of both our internal or inside the cells as well as the external or outside of the cells environment. And the goal of our body is almost always homeostasis. Okay, everybody say homeostasis. Homeostasis is maintained by balancing our conditions of pH. We're going to talk a little bit more about pH in a little bit. Ions. Does anybody know what an ion is? An ion is a positive or negatively charged atom. Okay? We can maintain it through chemical reactions. We can transport molecules between our internal and external environments, so inside the cell or outside of the cell. Okay? And it's really important that our blood pH is maintained at about 7.4. That's our average. We range from 7.35 to 7.45. And this is a really narrow range that our blood is maintained because if we get outside of that, it can actually make us really, really sick because the proteins within our body can't function outside of those pH levels. Our body temperature is maintained at about 98.6. We can range from 97.6 to 99.6 as sort of that normal temperature. Anything outside of that, there's a reason that our body moves the body temperature outside of that range. So what happens to your cells if you become dehydrated? Think about that for a second. If dehydrated, some of the symptoms of dehydration might be that you get thirsty, you get nauseous, okay? You might get hot or even have a fever if you're dehydrated. Okay. But specifically what happens to your cells, right, is if you imagine a cell is just sort of a water-filled sack. When we become dehydrated, that means that we don't have enough water on the outside of the cell. And so the water would actually move out of the cell, okay, because we want to keep it balanced at all times. Same thing if we're overhydrated. If we have too much water on the outside of the cell, then the water is going to move into the cell. Okay? And so we're trying to balance that. Water moves through osmosis. So metabolism is the chemical reactions that maintain homeostasis. That's keeping us at a balance. Anabolism, and Anna likes to build stuff up. I don't know if you've ever looked up Anna. Maybe you want to look up some Anna building plans if you want to build a table or anything else. But anabolism is when smaller particles combine to make larger ones. And when we do that, we use a lot of energy, right? When we're building stuff up, it takes a lot more time to rebuild than it does to tear down. And it also takes more energy to build stuff than it does to tear it down. Catabolism, on the other hand, catabolisms like cats, they like to break things up, they like to shred it. So catabolism is taking larger particles, breaking them apart, and making smaller ones. And that's going to release out the energy that's being stored. You may have heard of ATP in prior classes, adenosine triphosphate, and we actually use this molecule, this adenosine triphosphate, and we build it up and we break it down. We build it up, ATP, anabolism, we use energy, we actually store the energy within the bonds of the phosphate groups, right? So let me see if I can draw us a little picture here. Hopefully you can see this. Okay. And so if we have our adenosine and our phosphate groups, okay, adenosine triphosphate is adenosine and then our 3 phosphate groups, right? So you can see there's our adenosine and then 1, 2, 3 phosphate groups, right? And so what happens is we actually bind them together. We form bonds between the phosphate groups and the adenosine. And that's storing energy in here. So if I were to break one of these, adenosine triphosphate. Okay. If I were to break one of these bonds, out comes the energy. The energy is going to come out of the bond. Okay. And on the flip side, when I want to build that back up, every bond that I make, I'm storing energy in there. So the energy is going to go in there when we store it. Okay. So let's get back to our slide. Okay. So that's what we're doing here, is that we are actually storing our energy in here. So when we do anabolism or we build it up and we use energy, we can store the energy within the bonds. And when we break those bonds apart and we do catabolism, we're going to release the energy back out. So a lot of what happens within our body is done through feedback, okay? And when we have a negative feedback, we have a sensor, a control center, and an effector, okay? And essentially what we're doing is this is very similar to a thermostat within your house, right? So you set the thermostat to, let's say, 72 degrees, right? And so what happens is when we get outside of that 72 degrees temperature in our house, we're going to turn on the compressor, right? So let's say it's raised up, it's got really hot outside, so it's up at 75. So that's going to turn on the compressor and it's going to start cooling down the temperature. And then when we get back to 72, we're going to turn off the compressor, right? And so that's that negative feedback loop. When we get back to our normal point, we turn it off. We turn off the change. okay? So you can see here, we have a sensor, and that sensor is going to sense the change within the body. These can be our temperature receptors within our skin. It can also be our thermostat. The control center is going to process that information, and it makes a decision, so to speak, and it directs a response. Most often that occurs in the hypothalamus of the brain. And then the effector carries out the final corrective action, like the compressor. It's turning on the air conditioner. Okay. And so you can see here what happens with body temperature regulation within our body. Okay. So our stimulus is that our body temperature exceeded 37 degrees Celsius. That's going to cause the nerve cells in our skin and our brain to then send a signal to our temporary temperature regulatory center within our brain, like at our hypothalamus, and that's going to cause sweat. Once we start sweating and we cool off, we're going to turn off the mechanism. We're going to stop sweating. Okay? We also have a positive feedback loop, and a positive feedback loop is going to consistently cause it to continue to get stronger. Okay, so 3 mechanisms of this are childbirth, blood clotting, and lactation. Okay, so during childbirth, what happens is that we have these stretch receptors that get activated within the uterus. Those signal our brain to release oxytocin. The oxytocin is going to cause those muscles to contract. Therefore, we're going to activate those stretch receptors even more, which is going to cause us to release even more oxytocin, which is then going to cause more or stronger uterine muscles to contract. So we're going to continue to contract stronger and stronger until the baby is delivered. Once the baby is delivered, then we stop with the oxytocin contraction. Same thing happens with blood clotting. Okay, so we have an injury and we're going to start, platelets are going to arrive to the site. Those platelets are going to start getting stuck, and those platelets are then going to send out a signal, a cytokine signal, which you may have heard of. This cytokine has been in the news recently. Cytokines are a sort of a cell signaling mechanism that our cells use to talk to one another. And it's going to cause us to do more blood clot and send out more platelets. And as more platelets arrive, we're going to send out the call for more platelets and more platelets and more platelets until we've clotted the blood. Okay? Same idea with lactation. Lactation is breastfeeding, so milk production. And so the more often that the baby suckles, then the more lactation or the more milk is going to be produced. So let's talk a little bit about our anatomical position and directional terms. Okay? These are very important that you learn these now rather than later, because we're going to keep coming back to them. Okay? So that term of anterior actually means the front. It also, we can use it as ventral. So when we talk about animals, oftentimes we'll talk ventral instead of anterior. Okay, because it's kind of hard to know what's the front of a dog, so to speak. Okay, so anterior and ventral, they mean the same thing. They're the front. It's forward facing for where the face actually faces. And then posterior is going to be on the back. You can also use dorsal, like a dorsal fin found on a dolphin. Inferior is also known as caudal. That's going to mean below. Superior is going to mean above or cranial. Lateral is going to mean to the side. Medial is to the middle. Proximal and distal we use together. So proximal would mean closest to the attachment point, whereas distal would be further away. So you can see here that the ankle is distal to the hip, okay? Or the hip is proximal to the toes. Okay. Superficial is going to mean towards the surface, and deep is going to be deep. That one's kind of the easiest one. Okay. We also have some directional planes to be able to talk about sort of what's happening within the body. So sagittal is going to be dividing into a left and right. We can use the term mid-sagittal. Mid-sagittal would mean that it's going to be dividing directly in half, okay, and so that we would have an even left and right. Okay. And this creates a medial versus lateral plane. We have transverse. Transverse is going to be dividing into above and below, so superior versus inferior. And then we can have what's called a frontal plane. We also sometimes call it coronal. Okay? And that's going to be dividing into a front and a back, or an anterior, posterior, or ventral to dorsal. Okay? These are some body regions. Okay, so when we talk about the body regions, we have different cavities, so to speak, where we're going to keep some of our organs. Okay, so this is a cranial cavity, and the cranial cavity is going to contain our brain. We also have the vertebral cavity, which is going to contain our spinal cord. You have the thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity is going to contain the lungs. Okay? And then we have our mediastinum, which is right directly between the lungs. Okay? And so you can see there's the superior mediastinum as well as the mediastinum here where our heart is contained. These are this area between the lungs. We have our abdominal cavity where we're going to find all of those abdominal organs, okay, like our stomach, our intestines. We have the pelvic cavity, and together we call those the abdominal pelvic cavity. We have the ventral body cavity, and that's going to contain those thoracic regions as well as the abdominopelvic regions. Okay? We have the dorsal body cavity, which is going to contain the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. There's different serous membranes. Serous membranes are these thin membranes. They cover the walls of the walls and the organs within the thoracic cavity. Okay, so we have the pleura. The pleura is going to surround the lungs. We have the pericardium, which is going to surround the cardiac or the heart. And then the peritoneum is going to cover over all of our tummy organs. So some regional names. The head is also known as the cranial region. So everybody touch your head and say cranial. Touch your neck and say cervical. Touch your armpits and say axillary. Touch your chest and say thoracic. Touch your belly button and say umbilical. Touch your lower back as your lumbar. Touch your butt. It's called the gluteal. Your groin is the inguinal. Okay. For our upper limbs, the upper arm is called the brachial region. Our forearm is called our antebrachial. Wrist is the carpal, and then our hand or palm is called the palmar. Our lower limbs, so down to our leg, and the thigh is called the femoral. The lower leg is called the crural. The ankle is called the tarsal region. The front of your knee is called the patellar. The back of the knee is the popliteal, and then the plantar is the bottom of your foot. So I encourage you to kind of go through touching each part of the body and saying what the regional name is. These here are your abdominopelvic regions and quadrants. These are a really good way to determine sort of what's happening. We can sort of help to diagnose depending on where the pain is, for instance, within a patient. Okay, and so when we go here in the center, right where the umbilical cord is, that would be the umbilical region. To the left is the left lumbar. To the right is the right lumbar. Below that is going to be the hypogastric region. Right? And then over to the edges, we have the iliac region. So right here, you can actually feel your hip bones. And the part of your hip bone that you can feel is actually called the iliac crest. That's why it's called the iliac region. Okay. If we go above our umbilical region, we're going to hit the epigastric. Epic means around. So around the gastric or the stomach region. Okay. We have the hypochondriac and the right hypochondriac regions there. We can also divide into quadrants. Those are a little bit easier. Quadrant means four for quad. Okay? And so we have the right upper, right lower, and left lower. So we're also going to have to do some movement vocabulary. So circumduction is actually going into a circle. Okay? Flexion is when we flex. So if you were to flex your muscles. Extension would be to extend out. Abduction means going away from your body. So when you lift your arms up and away, that's abducting. And then when you add them back into your body or put them close, it's called adduction. Supination is when we put our palms to the sky. Pronation is putting our palms to the planet. Inversion is turning your soles in, and eversion is turning your feet out. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about some medical imaging really quickly. We have x-rays, CT, PET scans, ultrasound, and MRI. And depending on what we're looking for is sort of the reasoning that we would be doing each of these medical images. So for instance, for x-rays, which is right here, that's usually looking at the bones themselves. So you can look for broken bones or any issues with how they're growing. CT scan is when we're going to get sort of more of a brain scan or something looking at the soft tissues. PET scan is positron emission technology, and that's usually when we're looking for cancer Not always, but usually some sort of foreign body or cancer. Ultrasound is when we're looking at also soft tissues. We use this specifically when someone is pregnant. We can use an ultrasound to look at the developing fetus, as well as we can look at soft tissues. And then MRI is magnetic resonance imaging, and so we might look for injuries to the brain or the spinal cord is often used with MRIs. Okay, so if you have any questions, you know where to find me. You can reach out to me at mburke@cecil.edu if you have any questions. Thank you.